GM everyone. We have our episode live with Terence from Cartridge. I'll quickly let Terence introduce himself and Cartridge, and we'll take it forward from there.
Awesome, Abbas. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm Terrence, one of the co-founders of Cartridge, and we've been building inside of the StarkNet ecosystem for about 3 years now, trying to bring to life this idea of fully on-chain games in autonomous worlds. So games that exist entirely on the blockchain, where the logic and state it can all be either executed directly on or verified on the blockchain. And we've been developing a few different technologies to enable this. One of the more well-known ones is Dojo, a tool chain for developing fully on-chain games or provable games. And excited to chat and share a little bit more about, I think, like the funding round and some of the roadmap and what we have planned for Cartridge and Dojo.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe let's start with what Dojo does, right, and what Dojo is focused on. Maybe on-chain games and what that means to you. I think there's a range in what you could consider an on-chain game, everything from logic to the assets. I suppose maybe you could describe that. What does that What does that mean for Dojo exactly?
Yeah, so Dojo is focused on enabling this idea of fully on-chain games. So the games where the state and the logic exist entirely on the blockchain. We started kind of this journey about 3 years ago. From my personal journey, started with the Dope Wars ecosystem, where we created Dope Wars shortly after Loot and started developing a fully on-chain recreation of a classic game called Drug Wars, which is essentially like an arbitrage game that we wanted to live entirely on the blockchain. Um, and in parallel, Loaf, who I see might join us here, was working on something similar in the Realms ecosystem, which was derived from the original Loot NFTs, with a similar idea of building games fully on chain. So Dojo kind of came around about a year and a half after that. After we had spent a bunch of time in the Dope Wars and the Realms and a few others in the ecosystem, had spent a bunch of time trying to build this fully on-chain games. And it coincided with the advent or with the release of Cairo 1, where we kind of came together to develop this tool chain to make it significantly easier for people to develop these types of games. So Dojo is a tool chain that basically covers almost every phase of the development cycle of building a game. Provable games are designed to replace essentially like the back-end components of a traditional game and allow these games to inherit a lot of the affordances of the blockchain. Dojo contains a language or framework for defining them on chain. So you have a world contract, and then you have models and systems of how state can be modified and state can be stored on the blockchain. We have like Sozo, which is command line tool for deploying and migrating smart contracts onto a blockchain like StarkNet. We have Tori, which is what's called an automatic indexer that will automatically index any models or that you've defined in your world and expose them over APIs, gRPC, or GraphQL, fully typed APIs with low latency and in real time for the game client to consume and render the experience for the user. We have Katana, which is a sequencer specialized for the on-chain gaming use case. It's focused specifically on low latency, high throughput deployments, and can operate in both ephemeral or persistent modes, depending on how the game wants their blockchain to be architected. And then we have Saya, which is a tool for settling provable computations that's responsible for basically taking some computation that's executed by Katana, generating a proof of it, and then verifying that on StarkNet or using any kind of Stark verifier.
All right, makes sense. I think let's speak about maybe the funding round and what's up next for Dojo in itself or Cartridge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we closed our funding round actually earlier this year, but we recently announced it. It was led by one of the top gaming investors, Bitcraft, which we're incredibly excited to work with. Nico from Bitcraft, who led the round, has been very supportive of this ecosystem. He's like a gaming veteran and has seen it all and seen the platform shifts happening in other ecosystems, or as other platforms have become available, or across mobile or web or console and desktop. And I think like has been a big supporter of this idea of building blockchains as a new platform for distribution, and a new way to introduce like new properties to games that were not previously possible. And so Nico, we've known him for quite a while now. He's been in the trenches, attending the hacker houses and stuff like this, and has like a really good grasp of the vision that we're going after. So we're really excited to work with him and the Bitcraft team to secure the Series A funding and be able to invest a lot more in pushing the Dojo ecosystem forward. From I think the funding for us allows us to expand the amount of resources, obviously, that we are committed to the ecosystem. So we have the team of engineers working on the Dojo toolchain, and then on the cartridge side, we have a few products that facilitate like the productionalization of games built with Dojo. So we have Slot, which is a managed infrastructure as a service that allows, or like a roll-up as a service kind of infrastructure that allows teams that are building games to eventually deploy them as layer 3s or ephemeral rollups on top of Starknet. And then we have Controller, which is essentially an account or a wallet designed specifically for making it super easy to onboard players to games. It supports WebAuthn for self-custodial wallets that are stored where the credentials are stored in the secure enclave of your device. It supports session tokens, and we're adding an identity and reputation layer to it. And all the games in the Dojo ecosystem are pretty much today working on integrating Controller as we move games into production on Starknet, and quite a few games that we're working with now on kind of this ephemeral rollup, ZK threads architecture of deploying games on top of Starknet, where some components can live on Starknet directly, the parts that need like liquidity and access to DeFi ecosystems, and then we can offload like some of the complex computations of the game implementation itself to an external service that can run and then settle, be verified on Starknet at the completion of the game. And so the funding really enables a lot of this to continue, and I think is a great signal more broadly for the ecosystem and the teams building on top of Dojo and cartridge that we are able to sustain the development of this ecosystem over the long term, and they can be more comfortable making a bet on this like new and emerging, very exciting technology that it'll still be around in a few years from now.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to maybe what the developer experience or the builder experience looks like when working on Dojo, when building on Dojo as a game dev, I suppose. But something I want to highlight and something you mentioned briefly there was, because there's plenty of teams building on Dojo or will be building on Dojo going forward as well, what does interoperability look like for you? Is it on the asset level? Is it on the social level? How do you think of that? Because a lot of I'd assume different teams would have different elements on chain, like you rightly mentioned just a moment ago. So how do you think of that component?
Yeah, so Dojo is really designed to be extensible and composable, like by default, with the world architecture where you have a single contract that anyone can install new models and logic into it that can affect and create new games on top of like the shared foundation. And so it's interoperable and composable, and like at the lowest level, like any state inside of a Dojo application can be read by basically any other game inside of that world. And then Dojo implements an access control layer that allows like potentially new games to be spawned that can write to existing models. And we recently introduced this concept of namespaces, which further expands like the design space by allowing multiple games or to exist in parallel that use the same models and the same logic, but perhaps like have some slight permutation on the meta or the balance, or like somehow some attributes are interpreted or add some level, some additional mechanic to it. And so, inside of a Dojo world, everything is very interoperable and composable. And then Dojo also includes like ERC20 and ERC721 implementations that are Dojo native, but expose like standardized interfaces so that those assets can be inside of a Dojo world, but are still interoperable with protocols like Akubo, or NFT marketplaces or whatever. So you can kind of have the best of both worlds.
There's a two-part question over here. I think, do you envision a place where discoverability for these games becomes a thing that's something Cartridge aims to solve, or would you imagine it's a different team? For example, a marketplace or an open, I would say, a discovery platform for being able to swipe through and find the right kind of game that you want to play, potentially, irrespective of what kind of a game it is. Would that be something that's of interest to you as well, or would it be like a different team that might or can take something up?
I think it'll be a combination. I think marketplaces are not a good discovery mechanism for games. I think, like, what we've seen from the, a lot of the web 2.5 attempts is that leading with assets like turns off a lot of players. So you're essentially just tailoring towards like a speculative like kind of audience. What we've seen success, so there's some products that we're developing internally around the controller, and another product that we have called World Explorer that is essentially like indexes all of the Dojo games in the ecosystem and allows you to explore them at a very low level. But something else we've seen is like gaming ecosystems themselves as like distribution channels for games. So for example, Realms has Realms World. And inside of Realms World, there's a bunch of different games that are being developed, like Eternum and Pistols at 10 Blocks and Rising Revenant and Blobbert's Arena and these types of games. And essentially, Realms himself serves as a distribution channel and like a discovery platform for these games, and has, the built-in, like one of the interesting components of fully on-chain games. And, I think Realms is really demonstrating affordances is this ability to have like a built-in audience for the game that you're building. So Realms is a loosely defined ecosystem that has the Lord's token and the Realms like assets and some other stuff. And those holders of those assets are very eager to play and experiment with any of the games that are being developed inside of that ecosystem. So as a game, if you want, if you're building a game that fits well into kind of the lore of the Realms ecosystem, it makes a lot of sense to build it as part of that. You have this built-in audience, you put it there, they put it on Realms.world, you have discoverability, you have some level of distribution, you potentially have support for funding, as well as like a very like strong community around that. So I think, my personal opinion is, I think like probably some of the more robust distribution channels will be around like specific IPs or ecosystems that develop like Realms World, and there'll be other ones for other types of lores, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of other different attempts at this. I think like people just trying to layer on a discovery layer will have like quite limited success in the short term. Maybe in the long term it'll make more sense.
How would you describe like the game dev experience once someone gets started or wants to get started on Dojo? And would you say at each step, or whichever are the more important steps in that journey, let's say, is Cartridge involved as a program, as a support, things that you offer to like take teams from 0 to 1 or help them out at every stage? I'm assuming like funding was one of the things you mentioned, if it's
Mm-hmm.
something that's good. But yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, Cartridge, we really lead the development of Dojo. I mean, it's a community project and it's open source and it's a public good, and we're trying to continue encouraging others to contribute to the development of Dojo. But today, we have a lot of interactions across the entire developer journey with everyone building in the ecosystem. From a Dojo perspective, we have like starter kits or like starter projects that people can easily fork and get started with like a very simple implementation of, for example, like spawning a player and moving them around. We're working on a bunch of documentation as part of the Dojo book. You can kind of just go to dojoengine.org, copy a little script, and run it on your machine, and it'll install all the different components. You run Dojo up, you get Sozo, you get Katana, you get Tori, you get Saya, all locally on your machine. Straight from Sozo, you can actually bootstrap a project. You can make some modifications, or you can just keep it as the existing example project. You can spin up a Katana, you can deploy it, you can spin up a Tori, you can index your Katana, And then you can use like some of the libraries that we have around the SDK. So we have like the Unity SDK and the JavaScript SDK and some others that people in the ecosystem are building as well, that'll generate like type bindings from the client. So you really, from a developer experience perspective, it's really nice because you basically only worry about like the logic that is like the server side business logic of your application, and then the UI client side logic. Everything in between that typically adds like significant amount of overhead to developing is automatically done for you with like the Katana and the Tori and indexing and the SDKs and the binding generation. So it's a really nice developer experience from that perspective. As far as like taking a game from something you're developing locally and into production, like the developer experience or the developer journey that I think is most common is for people to take a game that they're working on locally and then use Slot to spin up a Katana, like a managed Katana instance and a managed Tori instance that you can interact with other people. So you can very easily do that with Slot from the command line. You can just write Slot, like create instance of Katana basically, and in a couple seconds you have a Katana. And the same for a Tori. You can deploy your world there with Sozo. You can use the cartridge controller, which is integrated across like all of the development platforms. So, or like you can use it locally for development. You can use it on Slot, or you can use it on Sepolia, and you can use it on mainnet. Your controller basically is this account that exists everywhere. It's great for players, but it's actually really nice for development as well. And so you can use a controller to deploy to Slot, and then you can send a URL to your front end to some friends or community or play testers or tweet it or whatever. People can come, they can show up. If they have a controller, they can use that same controller for your game, whether it's in play testing, whether it's on Sepolia, whether it's on mainnet, wherever it is. If they need to create a controller, they can very easily do that. Support across platform on mobile and web. And they can start playing a game. And we also take care of, for example, if you're in a play testing context, we have paymasters, so you never have to worry about anyone paying fees on Sepolia or on Katana or on SWAT. Those are all just abstracted away. We just fund everything with our paymasters. And then we support paymasters in production too. So in a couple of weeks, Loot Survivor 1.5 is going to be launching on StarkNet mainnet. With the controller integration, and we're working with them to basically subsidize all the games for the first week, where everyone can create controllers and play games for free on top of StarkNet in mainnet, and just demonstrate our ability to like onboard users into the ecosystem and get them playing these games. So that's kind of the full development life cycle of taking something like locally, getting involved like early on with Dojo, and then into production. I mean, I think taking advantage of the tool chain and the shared infrastructure that blockchains provides allows you to bring games into production with significantly less resources than traditionally is necessary.
Maybe you can help us with some examples of current games that are being worked on by teams, I suppose, and games that you'd imagine would work perfectly well, or maybe much more superior as an on-chain gaming system, right? Do you have examples or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, like almost anything except for like FPS games can
Yeah.
work within the constraints of the blockchain today. There's a ton of different games now being built inside of the Dojo ecosystem. We're actually hosting right now with the Dojo residency in collaboration with StarkNet here in New York, where we have 30 of the top builders of the ecosystem all collaborating and building games in person together. There's a long list of games now. There's close to 30 different games. A lot of experimenting with different types of mechanics to put on chain. I think doing games that are more strategic or more turn-based, like RPG style games, fit very neatly into the blockchain constraints. Obviously, like anything that's a board game fits very easily onto a blockchain. And then there's we're starting to see experimentation with mechanics around hidden information or private information or partial information games that we can start to put on chain using like some of the unique affordances provided by Cairo and StarkNet. I think there's a ton of experimentation, but I think like broadly speaking, a lot of the traditional gaming mechanics and genres can now be built on top, like fully on chain using these new technologies.
And what's the current split of interest between teams? Like, are these mostly crypto native teams that come to you or express interest or are currently building, or are you also seeing some outside interest from folks that go like, you know what, there's potential here, and I could build something?
I would say, I mean, we see a combination. We're starting to see more and more of the latter of people from the traditional gaming ecosystem, like interested in, there's a massive problem in traditional game development, especially right now in distribution and go to market. You can build games that are compelling and you just, no one ever cares. Like the game is great, but you never have enough of an audience to bootstrap like a community around it, to have a hit a critical mass where the game becomes sustainable and makes sense to continue investing time and effort in it. Games, are also very resource intensive to produce. And I think these issues can be addressed with the blockchain or like fully on-chain games quite well. I mean, we know that blockchains are really good at bootstrapping communities and ecosystems around games through stakeholder alignment. Like we've demonstrated that um, uh, time and time again. I mean, I think that's like one of the easiest things seemingly to do in the crypto space. And then reducing like the resources necessary to deploy games, being able to reuse existing components from other games or build on top of other games without having to worry about platform risks that are typically associated with building on top of other games means that building games in this space is becoming more and more compelling to traditional game developers as well. And so we start to see more and more of them come into the ecosystem.
This is more of a question that I've pondered upon over the last year or so, last year and a half, because I've been working with a few gaming teams. And one of the companies I was working with was trying to build UGC platforms to enable people to create games, game devs to go ahead and push out games using existing modules and modes available. What kind of stakeholders would you imagine are a part of the entire Dojo ecosystem? Would there just be the game dev and the consumer, or the end user, or the gamer? Or would you imagine there are some other people involved in the process as well? That could be someone that creates assets, things like that. Do you have thoughts on
Mm-hmm.
what that coordination looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dojo itself doesn't have a strong opinion on this. Like, you could build games and have different like abstractions. You could build a game specifically for an end user, or you can build games that are that There's a few teams actually as part of the residency and more broadly in the Dojo ecosystem that are experimenting with this like a unique ability of blockchains to transfer value, right? To route value at a bunch of different levels of abstraction, which I think is quite interesting because you can start to build games with UGC where contributors can be rewarded for even like very small contributions to it, right?
Yeah.
You can imagine gaming ecosystems where like when someone plays a game, funds are flowing to like thousands of people that have contributed to the development of it in some small way. And like today that's just not possible. If you look at UGC platforms like Roblox and Minecraft and stuff, and Fortnite Creator, most people in the world can't access those ecosystems. It's just they aren't supported on traditional payment rails. They have like high thresholds for how much money you need to make before you can be rewarded for some experience that you build. And they have they take a very significant chunk of any of the fees that you or the value that you create in those ecosystems. And blockchains with native payment rails is accessible to everyone in the world and enables like a lot more experimentation around these unique monetization models in UGC kind of models. I think is going to be pivotal to the future of like what UGC in these kind of gaming ecosystems looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think that's one of the coordination problems that blockchain solves. Anything that has a coordination problem, you end up finding a solution on chain, I suppose. And that could be interesting for sure. How do you think of the end consumer experience as far as games are concerned? Because now one of the major issues we hear about most games in crypto is that one, they're not fun. Two, it's hard to play these games because the experience point matters. So just getting an asset to join the game, or having a wallet in the first place. And you did emphasize on the fact that you had paymasters and a bunch of things that would abstract away a lot of the on-chain difficulties. But maybe you could talk about what do you think the end game for an experience for a crypto or a game built on chain looks like, especially something that's entirely untested and tried before, especially at scale, right?
Hmm. I mean, I think a lot of the pain points that you mentioned are emergent based on the fact that like Web 2.5 games like led with assets, right? Like their primary innovation was selling people assets in a game that doesn't exist. And once they've already captured all that value, there's very little incentive for them to actually build like an interesting game or a compelling game. They just have to build like something, right? And given like the value that's like the first kind of step of onboarding to those ecosystems, yeah, you had to have a wallet and you had to say like, give back up your seed phrase. Like this is going to, you're spending, thousands of dollars on an NFT for a game that might exist in the future. You don't want to lose that value. Like the entire paradigm was entirely like not incentive aligned with this idea of building games that are fun and actually driving value back to the participants in an ecosystem. So I'd say, from a technology perspective, like we're focused on solving a lot of those problems. And with things like Slot, you can even have free to play models where you can onboard users without a wallet entirely. And then, one of the interesting unique affordances of zero knowledge proofs is you can decide at some point in the future to generate a proof, which is really like the expensive part of it. So you can even have like, free to play models for onboarding users into games. You can actually build compelling games on chain where you don't have, like Oracle problems that exist with like more Web 2.5 games and can be more strongly correlated with the actual game experience and the assets or, the value that stakeholders derive from it, from participating in those ecosystems. And yeah, with account abstraction from Starknet, with paymasters, with, basically sub-cent fees for interacting, a lot of the pain points of interacting with the blockchain can be abstracted away. And from an end user perspective, it looks much more like a regular game when you're onboarding and you're interacting with it for the first time. I mean, you can already see that with a lot of the games that we have today deployed with Dojo and the cartridge controller and these products.
Yeah, sounds good. So I think that's pretty much all the questions I had for you, Terence. I think if you have something that you want to leave the audience with, we can wrap up the show with that.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I would just say, the Dojo ecosystem is very friendly and welcoming. If anyone is interested in exploring what it looks like to build a fully on-chain game, or even using Dojo and the tools, we've seen people use them for other types of application development that aren't games. It can significantly improve the development experience of building any type of application. Really, games are just like the most complex game type of application. Feel free to hop into the Dojo Discord or the Cartridge Discord. You can go to dojoengine.org. The Twitter handles Ohayo, OHAYO _dojo, or cartridge _ GG. You can follow us there. Feel free to reach out to me in person. And yeah, we'd be happy to help and support anyone in kind of getting started down the journey of building applications and games with Dojo.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for doing this, Terence. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Abbas. All right.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye.